Indiana Disability History Project, Indiana Institute on Disability and Community, Indiana University. Muscatatuck Oral History, Sarah Poole, October 30th, 2003.
Okay, I went there in May of '68, and then I just recently retired. I retired in over 35 years. I can't tell you exactly, but.
And what made you interested in working?
Well, I have to tell you, we were deep in debt, and I put my application in every place in the county, and that's the first place that called me. So that's how that happened.
So you could have worked anywhere you chose.
Yeah.
Really big
chance.
Job.
Just chance.
You didn't necessarily have friends and family.
Well, I've had family. I had a brother-in-law that worked there, and I had a cousin that worked there, but that really didn't have any impact on it. It was just chance at the time. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did you get any training once you got your job?
Oh yes, better training than they get now. It was a full 6 weeks, very, very intensive. We had to keep a notebook, and the notebook was graded, and it was just really, really extensive training. It's very outdated for what we know now, but they were very, very strict about our training.
And so that would have been like
68. And we also had to take it was an Army test or something. It was a very strange test. It was a very involved test. And if you didn't get a certain rating on that test, then you were offered a job maybe in housekeeping or someplace else. But yeah, they were very strict.
Was that your first job, or did you do some other stuff?
Well, when I got out of high school, I worked at the bank as a bookkeeper for a while. And back then, I collected unemployment because the boss did not believe in working mothers. I had a baby. There were 3 of us that worked at the bank, and we all 3 had babies about the same time. And we went to sign up for unemployment, and they said, "Why didn't you go back to your job?" And we said, "He doesn't believe in working mothers," and so we collected unemployment. And that, no questions asked. That was just how it was okay. And so.
So when you were working at Muscatatuck, how was the pay there compared to other opportunities in the area?
Well, it compared favorably. See, my husband at that time, I think, was making, I worked at the bank, and I made $50 a week. That's before taxes. And that was acceptable pay in that time frame. And he made like $50 or $60 a week. So, and the fact that and I was young enough not to really appreciate it, but we had benefits as well, which at the time I didn't appreciate that. But, I do now.
So it was a fair wage.
Yes, Mm-hmm.
And where did most of the staff live?
Well, Ripley County, here. I think mainly like Versailles and up that direction, and North Vernon, that I'm aware of. In the county, this county and the other county.
Did you have neighbors who were in this area that you knew that worked there?
Not really. No, you always got that, like, it takes a special person. It really, everybody said that. And, but, it was.
Well, back in its heyday, it seemed to be a very large contributor to the income of people in this
Oh,
area.
yes. And it still was until just a few years ago, a very large contributor to this area. Because, like, Jennings County didn't have a lot of manufacturing jobs and things like that. People that lived in North Vernon, most of them drove to Columbus to work, to Cummins Engine Company and Harvin's and things like that. So, yeah, it was a big contributor to them.
So people outside of Muscatatuck, what do they think about the work that
Yeah, well, most of them would say, "I could never do that." Never having been there, they had no clue. And
what do you think they thought Muscatatuck was?
well, we had people with very strange behaviors and strange appearances. And it was just, I think it was that more than anything else.
So in the early days, how would you describe people that came to care?
Well, I'd have, from my standpoint, probably, well, I remember hearing stories that doctors would say, you know, to the mother when a baby was born that had a lot of problems. They'd say, it's best that you don't even see the baby. We'll take care of it. Just go on with your life. And that would be many of them. My friend Jan worked in the nursery, and a lot of babies would come directly from the hospitals there because of their birth defects and things like that. And,
so when they used to call it blue babies and just mongoloids and all the terms they used to use all the time, but those babies ended up coming straight from the
most of them did, yeah. Yeah, and you have to consider, too, like there was no support for anybody. And if a doctor said, pat you on the shoulder and said, we'll take care of it, why, you know, you knew the doctor was going to take care of it.
That's the right thing to do.
Yeah, and, you know, we didn't argue with doctors. Doctors, they knew best. Yeah.
So you saw a lot of people in medical cancer have babies.
Yes, I'm sure they did. We had a waiting list at one time, and you know, a lot of times they might be 6 years old before they were admitted. Also, we had a very good school system at that time, and earlier, you know, and a lot of them, I think that would be the only chance for any education at all. They weren't invited to the school. They were invited not to be in the schools. And so we had a principal, we had teachers, you know, we had a school program. And I remember one family that I was closely involved with, the mother wanted the best for her daughter. And they moved to the county so that she could visit her, and she would take, you know, her school friends home, and they'd have parties at home and so forth. But she just wasn't in the community, so to speak. You know, she needed to be away from the community, but she did get an education that way.
So some parents would have thought, like you said, that they could get an education.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was their best shot at anything. I had a cousin that's just 2 years younger than I am, and when she was 14, the teachers told my grandmother, you know, well, she's old enough to quit school now, don't send her back. And I mean, they were able to do that. And so my grandmother was able to find a school for her to go to in Columbus, and got her back and forth to Columbus to, you know, get some more education. She was giggly, and she was distractible, and teachers just wouldn't put up with it. They didn't have to. My sister was in one of her classes, and she says, I remember poor Janice, you know, she sat back in the corner by the radiator, and, you know, the teacher just ignored her, and she'd sit there and, you know, melt crayons on the radiator and what have you. And she just simply learned anything she learned was by osmosis, because the teacher wasn't going to take any kind of, you know, special pains with her or anything. And that was society then. Mm.
Kind of talking about the 70s now?
No, this would have been the 40s.
Oh, okay. I thought you were
Yeah.
talking about when you first worked.
No, it's my cousin that's just 2 years younger than I am. Yeah, so this would have been the 40s. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, and so when you think back to when you first got there, people that were there had behaviors that were different looking or something.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit more than that.
Well, we had a lot of people that had hydrocephalus, just like a whole room of people. And, you know, their heads weighed probably 20, 30 pounds. And you can't, you know, they're very difficult to take care of. Plus, you know, they don't look, you know. And when I went there to work, and while I was in training, one of the doctors that spoke to my class, he told us all these wonderful, marvelous things that were being done, and we would not see these things ever again. That these things just wouldn't exist, you know, with medicine at the point it was, because they could insert shunts. We had people with microcephaly and very, very small heads, and it would grow together too soon. And so what they would do is would put spacers in there so that it wouldn't go, the bone wouldn't seal, and then their skull could expand, as their brains grew. And we had since identified PKU, and those things just wouldn't happen anymore. Of course, having a shunt does not necessarily mean that you're going to develop normally, and having, yes, yeah, yeah. And of course, that was the early years, And at that time too, he was just really angry at one particular family. With PKU, it's hereditary, and usually each child after the first one will be more involved than the earlier children. And people had large families, and of course doctors were saying, it can never happen again. Don't worry about it. Just go ahead and have more babies. And they had identified this particular family, and we had 3 members of the family there, and then the younger children, and they identified PKU and wanted to put them on the diet, and the parents refused to put them on the diet. And at that time, there was nothing they could do. They get to make the decision, and then they would be admitted later too. And, yes, whole families. And I know my friend Jan probably can tell you the numbers of some of the families. There were several families, large numbers of the children were there.
And what age would they typically come to if you're a large family? So at 6, I go in, and then a couple years later, my sibling comes in, and she gets a little older, and they come in.
I think it just depended. Now, I'm not real sure, because a lot of times I'm sure welfare had to step in, because we had some people that, their diagnosis was, and who knows if it was correct or not, but they were starved as children. They didn't get, good treatment at home. There was always a story of the fellow that they left out in the pig lot, laying in a big black iron kettle, and when they picked him up, they just picked kettle and all up and brought him in before he got any kind of, kind treatment. So, yeah.
And you think the family did that? They didn't take care of the son and daughter?
I'm not sure. There's an awful lot of people, even yet today, that are living in the community, and they're functioning, that they really don't know how to treat people. We've the stories now, the babies in the trash and all that kind of stuff. I think that's just, and if you live like far out in the country back then, in the 30s and the 40s, people weren't watching you very close, and I'm sure I don't know. Yeah, I think many people had just a different attitude. I don't know if I told you about my sister-in-law. She's 2 years older than I am. I was born at home too. She was born at home, and the neighbors would come to help. When there was a baby born, the neighbor ladies would come to help. And he stopped by, and he looked at her, and he said, a blue baby, they don't live very long, and just kind of laid her aside and took care of the mother. And he sat down and filled out a death certificate for my sister-in-law. And he said, I'll stop by tomorrow and see how are, and if she lives, I'll make out a birth certificate and throw this death certificate away. Well, the ladies that were there worked with Shirley and so forth, and he came back by the next day and he said, didn't think she'd have made it. But he filed the death certificate and didn't make out a birth certificate. When she got to be retirement age, I tell you, that's been a headache. But it was kind of like just, I don't know, maybe the prevailing attitude. And there was a big scandal, I think it was Harvard Medical School, maybe 20 years or so ago. There was a doctor that was kind of advocating that we not take the extra precautions.
I think you sent me an email about
I think I did.
They had to be really careful at Muscatatuck, because if they caught a doctor too quickly, then the nurses would be scolded.
Oh, yeah, that's the ones where the mother would say, the doctor, just before the baby was born, she would hold the mother's legs together.
This is actually at Muscatatuck.
Well, no, these were people that were born in regular hospitals. A lot of them, I think, even like army hospitals and things like that. And no, we never had anybody born there. I mean, you know, but no, this was just the general population. And that's when that nurse explained that to me, because I would see that in a lot of the records, you know, that the mother claimed, and they always have little quotation marks there, that the nurse held her legs together. That's what the nurse explained to me. She said, if you've ever been raked over the coals for calling him away from a golf game or a cocktail party, you're real careful. Because doctors were really, you know, they treated nurses very bad in that day, too. And, so we don't know if that had any effect or not, but one would say it probably did.
Right, some of the charts.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Of course, no one wanted to give the mother any credit for telling a truthful story, but, you know, that was, most likely that was, I mean, we had strange diagnoses for various things then, too, you know, which don't translate well in today's age, you know, we had, well, let's see, there used to be a classification, and I'm not sure exactly how this went, because it was going out of style when I came there. Like, there were idiots and imbeciles, and, you know, those were classifications that they gave. Yeah, and I'm not sure the order, because that wasn't something that was necessary for me to learn. You know, that was just like a historical thing that they used to do. And, yeah, we went to Educable, and yeah, from there, yeah. Mm-hmm. No, not. I think it was more important for the people that wrote the reports. It was real important. You know, you had to learn the lexicon, and you had to, when you wrote your report, you know, there were certain ways the reports were written. And so the people writing their reports, because you always had to have reports, you know. And then those of us who were actually taking care of people, that really didn't have any impact on what we did, you know.
What was your job?
Well, I started out as an attendant, and I worked as an attendant from 68 to 75. And then I had kids starting school, and I kind of wanted more. Another thing, it was chance, you know. I put in for every job opening that came up within the grounds, you know, so I could have a 5-day job, you know. And so then I got the job in speech and hearing, and then I was there till I retired. Loved it. Yes.
Did you like working?
Yes, I had very many times I was very angry and very miserable because of the decisions made by those above me, you know. A lot of times I'd be real upset about that. But, you know, when you work for, I guess it's almost like being in the Army. You either salute or shoot your toe off so you can get out. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. I worked for a very nice lady, and she really was into training. She really gave us a lot of deep training. And of course, back then, what we learned as to what they learn every year when they come out of school is vastly different. But, yeah, and we had a chance to be really, you know, closely involved. And
You all were pretty close.
yeah.
Excuse me, the retirement committee. It seemed like you all were your own community.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So was there,
Mm-hmm.
from the time you started till you left, did you feel like there was a pecking order or like a hierarchy amongst different sorts of jobs?
Well, yeah, kind of. But I think probably like whatever job you were in, that's that little spot that you were in, that was just what you were involved in. And a lot of times we'd make fun of other people, you know. And a lot of times the administration, you know, some of the things that the administration would decide and some of the things they would do and so forth, you know, would be laughable. It just wasn't sensible. It didn't make sense a lot of times. And I said, well, you'll do it. And so we paid lip service to when they said, you'll do it. And then maybe 10 years later, throw that all out. We're not going to do that anymore. We're going to do something else. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What did you think of those other staff that were
Well, I don't know. I don't know if they ever caught on that we felt that they were figures of fun. I don't know if they did or if they cared, Like it's a tight little community, and if you think you're one of the elite, do you pay attention to the peons? Probably not. But, yeah, yeah. And I have to be quite honest, there were some of the administrators that didn't have anything about them was not admirable. They weren't people you had to pretend like you respected them because of their jobs, but since we were a tight little community, we knew too much about them. And
About their personal lives?
Yes. Their personal lives, yes. Yes, indeedy. Yeah.
So I wonder if you really wanted to.
Well, yeah, really. Yeah.
So what did people that worked there think of the residents?
Well, a lot of people had a lot of different opinions. I think most of us kind of went through a transition period. When you first went in, you would probably be appalled at some of the things you saw and some of the things you were expected to do. You would be irritated sometimes because of the types of behaviors that they had. And then after a while, then you would become, I don't know, like you felt so sorry for them. You just wanted to do everything. And then finally you would realize that, you just couldn't do everything for them. Then you would settle into the pattern of doing what needed to be done. And because, there were all levels of disabilities. So if you worked with the people that were nearly normal, you had a different set of feelings and a different way of dealing with them than if they were people that were, in carts and in beds and were being tube fed. And, you'd have a different way of. And I know people that had worked in the hospital and the infirmaries with those people that had to be lifted and turned and diapered and tube fed and all that. They had a different set of feelings than those of us who just worked there occasionally. And many of them never wanted to transfer or be moved from there. That they felt like they really needed to be there. And I've heard of people that were so devoted to their jobs and to their clients that even on their days off, they would call to check on them. Or a lot of them, like I said, Jan's family, they would take them home with them. I know my cousin used to bring a lady home with her on her weekend. And my brother-in-law did the same thing, too, with little Downs baby. He would bring her home on weekends, and then when he went back to work, when his days were up, he'd take her back, too. And that was allowed at that particular time. So
how were people differentiated? How did you look at it? And I guess, did they categorize people back then? Were there people that were maybe hard?
Mm-hmm.
That were really normal? Did they have other categories? Different sorts of people that lived at this kind of time?
Yeah, I tell you, when I first went there, I worked with very, very low-functioning males, that everything had to be done for them. I mean, you led them to the bathroom and you pulled their pants down and set them on the toilet, and then got them up. You had to feed them, you had to bathe them and dress them. Then I was transferred to the high-functioning, and that's what we called the high-functioning units. And I had high-functioning young ladies, and a lot of them worked in town, had jobs in town. And yes, various reasons, and I don't know. I don't think there was as much funding, maybe. Everything depended on funding. And we had a few that had apartments in town, and they had like pensions. Their parents were or father was a railroader or something. They'd have pensions, so they would have funding where they could pay for an apartment. Most of the ladies that I had when I worked with the high-functioning ladies were, I don't think they had any funding at all. They were wards of the state. And
if you were a well-off family and you had a child with a disability that needed to be institutionalized, Would they end up at Muscatatuck, or were there kids from all different economic levels?
Yeah, we had one fellow whose parents were, I don't know, professors at a college. I understood, and he was there, and more than likely, and even yet today, parents put a lot into it, and then there comes a time when you just can't anymore. And but most of the ones that I remember were probably, they misbehaved in the community, and they could either go to the girls' school or Muscatatuck, that kind of thing.
Did they have mental limitations?
Some of them didn't. The IQ test, I think 70 was kind of like the cutoff level, but and I'm not real sure. I didn't know all their histories that well. There was just no place for them in the community because of the behaviors, and they really weren't much different than you find in regular high schools now. But at that time, society just wouldn't tolerate it.
And this was the case more for females, would you say, or was it also young men that
Yeah.
behavior was not acceptable?
Oh yeah. We always had a lot more males, I think, than females, because people in the community weren't as afraid of females as they were the males, and so we always had a lot more. But a lot of them, we had some that were brought directly from like jails and so forth, and I think a judge had made the decision that they'd be better off there than someplace else.
Because there's that child that we got there as adults that basically couldn't, just like if you take care of them, you could try to make you whether they're just really good. You have to know if you can take care of yourself.
Well, I'm not real sure how all that worked. See, when I first went to work there were a lot of people that had been transferred there from the poor farm. Poor farms used to be the way communities dealt with people that couldn't take care of themselves. Yeah, and so there was a building of very elderly people, and most of them had been transferred from the poor farm. I think the powers that be probably decided poor farms were no longer the way to do it. That's just my understanding, because I know at one time, there were a lot of poor farms in the communities, and so I don't really know for sure, but
when you arrived
there were elderly people that had been there. Yes, yeah. And when I was in class, I don't know, we had to learn to interview, we had to learn to document, we had to learn to report behaviors and so forth. And they sent me out there, is why I knew that. And there was one lady, and she had a wooden trunk, with the humpback on, an elderly lady. And so she wanted to tell me all about Lucky Lindbergh. And, that was her big thing. And she had all kinds of newspaper clippings, and she sang the song, Lucky Lindbergh all the way through, and what have you. So, yeah, that was... and I would have considered probably she was, I don't know why she wasn't able to make it in the community. I don't know.
So, did you ever feel that you were not safe?
Yeah, several times. Yeah, well, when I first went there, right out of class, I hadn't been out of class very long, and I worked the evening shift we had the boys' side and the girls' side, or the men's side and the women's side. And heaven help them if they ever crossed over the line. They better not cross over the line. And it was down on the men's side. And there was an attendant that was going to go to supper, and they sent me down to a particular unit. And these guys were, I don't know, to me they were like you would find in a prison. They were big, strapping guys. Most of them worked on the farm. And they didn't really have opportunities to interact with females appropriately, shall we say. And So and I wasn't very old either. And they sent me down there, and it was the scariest event of my life. I mean, it was frightening. When I walked out in that day room, they all started to come this way, and just,
Were you by yourself?
yes. Oh, they didn't worry about us being safe then. They didn't worry about things like that.
Maybe
The management, yeah, they didn't worry about it. In fact, they think it was kind of funny, put you in that, they laugh about it later. But, yeah, and we've had, I managed to get out of that situation and stared him down and went back in the office and locked the door and hoped nothing happened till that guy came back from supper, because I was terrified. I just knew I was dead meat if I went back out there in that day room again. And
how many wrestlers would they have attended by one staff?
oh gosh, I think it was probably 60 or so down that way. And they didn't ask questions how that attendant kept order either, I can tell you, because that was scary.
So they usually have a big burly guy.
Yes. Oh, yeah. And for them to send me, I was probably in my 20s and, green as grass. Wasn't very nice of them. And we had some situations where women had almost been raped by patients. And, I remember when I worked the evening shift, they called and one of the things that they would have them do for punishment would be like when they misbehaved in that way, they would be put in the quiet room during the day and they could sleep all day long, just have a nice time. And then at night they would be sent to one of the lower functioning units and they were supposed to scrub the buildings. And I remember the terror of the women that was working the night shift when they knew certain ones were coming there to scrub because of their reputations, and they'd be there by themselves. And, yes, yeah. And I know one lady, they called her, it was at shift change, it was for the night shift, and wanted to send her down to one of those units where one of those people was living. And I remember her saying, but so-and-so's down there. And she said, no, sir, I am not refusing assignment, but so-and-so's down there. And I guess it just went back and forth until she said, I'm going, because you could be fired if you refused an assignment. And so she was on her toes all night, I can be sure of that.
Do you think it's fair to say that staff's best interest wasn't always?
No, and I think it was just the prevailing wind of the day, because I think wherever you work, that's kind of the way you were treated. Like it's just like the Roswell thing. Like the Army would say, people don't need to know. There were a lot of things that went on, and they felt like you just didn't need to know. It just wasn't your business, even though it was your business. I think that's just how business ran, and when people got to where they just wouldn't tolerate it, and they would protest and what have you. And, well, technically there was, but you pretty well knew, you knew whether you could complain or not, or you could leave, and that was usually how it was. Yeah, yeah. If you complained, you were, yeah.
Were there a lot of people, would you say, waiting to take your job if you left?
No, not at that time. There was a big turnover, and there were big groups of people going through class. At one time, they would train, like 40 people at a time, and they would go out on the units, and then after they were out on the units, half those people would not be working there. They'd run some more through the classes. And,
Because they just didn't stay around, basically.
yeah.
What would you say was reasons?
Oh, they had so many reasons. A lot of them, they didn't like the way they were treated by the authority figures. A lot of times they would go there because they needed the money, and maybe their husband got a better job. A lot of different things. Yeah, I don't think you could say any one particular reason. Just everybody had their own reason.
And the people that lived there, did they have labels? You mentioned some of them.
Yeah.
Did it matter? I mean, was there a hierarchy of the residents of the local community?
Yeah, yeah. Well, they had their, amongst themselves even, they had their own little, the higher functioning did, they had their own labels and so forth. As a lot of them had nicknames, and they weren't derogatory nicknames at all. I mean, they had nicknames and so forth, and then all of a sudden, you can't call them by their nicknames. We had one guy, his name was Sandy. His real name was William, but Sandy was his nickname. And so he, his whole life, that was the name he answered to. And then all of a sudden, no more. You could be fired if you called him Sandy. Well, he didn't know who William was. But, they do that every so often, I have a friend whose mother's had a stroke, and she's in a nursing home, and she's never been called by her first name. She's always been called by her middle name. And so they were complaining that she didn't respond. And she said, "What are you calling her?" Well, they were calling her by her first name because that's what they have to do. But that wasn't what she ever understood. And, so
it wasn't referred to as this house is a chair.
No. A lot of times, and it would be like the nurses and the doctors more so than anybody else. They would talk about that quadriplegic or something like that. But as to, we had the infirmary. When you lived on the infirmary, you definitely were either in a wheelchair or in a cart, that kind of thing. I can't really think that I'm aware of anything like that other than amongst themselves. A lot of times the higher functioning did.
The staff didn't refer to groups of people that way?
Not as a rule, no. Not the people that are taking care of them. Now, the people that would come and go, like the nurses and the psychiatrists or psychologists, and those people probably did to a certain degree. But if you actually were taking care of them, to stay there and to do a good job, you had to. I think one of the worst labels that we had, and that we were really given a lot of flack for, is you would sometimes say, "my baby." And it would be someone who might be 60 years old, but they are like a baby, and you've always taken care of them like a baby, and so you have to maybe reach that feeling within yourself so that you don't expect them to be any different than that, and we'd be in a lot of hot water for that, or boys. And actually, they might be functioning as a 2-year-old, but they were 40 years old. And a lot of times, they would say boys, and you could get in a lot of trouble for that. It wasn't meant that way. Mm-hmm. Oh, a supervisor coming through, or a nurse overhearing you, or something like that. Yeah.
So what happened?
Well, I don't really know for sure. In the early years that I was there, I think it just, for birthdays, I think those kind of went unattended to a certain degree, unless it would be somebody who had a real active family on the outside, like Muriel, who would make sure that her daughter had a birthday party and everybody there, her friends and so forth. But just the run-of-the-mill birthdays, I don't think so. Now, we always had big Christmas parties, and Christmas was always big. Easter was always big. We used to have a lot of we had a real active volunteer, office, and there would be groups that would, we'd have different buildings, and they would do a Christmas party for that building, and they'd bring in, Santa Claus and what have you. A lot of them did, yeah. In the early years when I worked there were a lot that would be going home for Christmas and for birthdays, and some of them would go home all summer and come back in the fall. But as I see, at one time we were still accepting new patients, and then when we stopped accepting new people, those people were just growing older. Well, their families were getting a lot older too. A lot of them didn't have a place to go, and they were older. Their parents were either gone or in nursing homes themselves. That was in the early years. They were easier about. I don't think they encouraged that at all after people got so, businesslike. I never did. No. Well, my time was almost past then, and at the time, I just had too much going at home. By the time I had a weekend off, gosh, my mother died at an early age of cancer, and we were dealing with that. And my husband's mother, we were dealing with her, and I was dealing with a teenager, and so basically, I never got to that point. Yeah, it was.
So when you were off, you wanted to be off.
Yes, yeah. Well, really, I needed to. We used to work like 7 days, and then we would be off 2. And then you'd go back to work, and you work 8 days, and then you would be off 4. And so usually the first day I'd be off, I didn't get off the couch because I usually had pretty active areas that I worked. Like we didn't have ward clerks, we didn't have housekeepers in the areas that I worked. And so, and there would be maybe 2 of us and 60 people that we had to bathe and get to bed. Then we had to go through, get them up, take them to the bathroom. And then after we got them to bed, then we started at one end of the building and we scrubbed one end of the building clear to the other end of the building. And, and then there would be days we'd be folding clothes and do whatever. And so, to be honest, I was exhausted. I just didn't have that kind of energy. I think if I'd had buildings where I didn't have to be so active. And I'd had several injuries and so forth too. So. Yeah.
When you talk about the early years, what time frame?
Well, the early years that I went there would have been from 68 to 75. That was a short period of time, yeah. Then when I moved over into speech and hearing, then it was a totally different thing. I was considered a teacher's aide, and so it was a totally different atmosphere than I worked in. But in those earlier years, why?
Did you get a pay raise when you changed?
Yeah, but it wasn't because of the job that I got. It was, and I never did figure out how this happened. Like everybody got a raise at the same time if we had money for it. When I went through class, after I got out of class, then I was supposed to get like a $20 raise. And we got paid every 2 weeks, so it'd be $20 every 2 weeks. And there was not enough money that year, so the people whose names were A to whatever got the raise, and we got slips that said due to insufficient funds. And so then when the next time came around, I didn't get back pay or anything. I just got the raise then from that point on. And so we used to get, raises in that manner. Across the board type of. No, well, those were considered merit raises, basically, is what it was. And every once in a while there'd be a memo would come out, you work under the merit system, and, favors that can't be done for you, you're going to get your raise if it's your time. But many, many times during that time frame, like every time there'd be a raise due, we would get the little slip that said due to insufficient funds. So then the next time around, you would get the raise, but like I said, it wasn't retroactive. You just got it then.
Within the second half of the office?
Yeah, I was in trouble. Usually in trouble that way. So when I transferred over Pauline Gregory was the head of the department, and she looked at what I was making, and she said, well, this is absolutely ridiculous. This shouldn't be. So I guess I had missed out on a couple of them. So I got up to what I should be, not a raise or anything like that. And, oh, they always promised you that, but it didn't always work out that way. I've had my name in the pot from the day I went in to be the next level, but then they weren't having classes for that next level. And then when I transferred over to speech and hearing, then it came due that they were going to train for that next level. By that time I was gone. But they always promised you that. But it was hard to advance yourself. Yeah. It just wasn't that easy. And I don't think it necessarily was at the Muscatatuck level. I think it was at the level where they decided how much money each place was going to get, more so than anything else.
What would happen if someone passed away?
At Muscatatuck?
Is there a cemetery there?
Yes, there is a cemetery there. It's on the back road, the back side there, and there's one side is for Muscatatuck, and the other side's for the people that live in Butlerville. And but many of them, I guess they would take them back home. It just depended on what their individual plans were. If the family was still actively involved and so forth, then their funeral would be at home. And I went to many funerals there on grounds. And, there would be like maybe one or two representatives of the family. Yeah. Yeah. Now they all did later on. That was one of the things that they started really pushing. It was like, and they just come up with a new way of doing things, I think. And that was one of the things that social services was working real hard at. There's a place in the chart for the burial arrangements. And that there would be, a lot of them have the arrangements already made. You see, we run into that thing of spend down too. If you know about Social Security and that kind of stuff. And so some of them had more money they needed to spend down. Well, that's the way they spent down, was pre-planning their funerals. Oh, wonderful. Yes. To me, I thought it was. Chaplain Chambers at that time he's since retired, but he was there for many years. And we had and I have to use this term, the higher functioning boys, the men that were able to follow directions and to do, they would dig their suits out and they would be pallbearers. And it's just like, I guess, like any community group, there's just people that usually end up being the pallbearer, And so, yeah, they were they were wonderful funerals, just as a funeral could be. Yeah. I think they do. Mm-hmm. I've not been out there. My friend Jan went out there one time. There was some people from one of the blind schools. So I'm not sure what group, but she wanted to know how many of the people were blind that were buried there. Gosh, dumb questions, And they wanted to know. She wanted to know why they were separated from the, part of it was the Muscatatuck and part of it was the community people. She wanted to know why they were segregated. And of course, I don't think there's a real answer for that, other than probably when the ground was set aside, for that use, and then probably the people from Butlerville were paying for their lots. So that's just my guess. Yeah, they're right there together. Well, it used to be on campus. We've since sold off or given away so much land. It's back where the dairy barn used to be, back down on that side of the road. And was the cemetery there before I don't know. I've not spent that much time out in that area. Muscatatuck's been there for an awful lot of years. And so, previous to that time, people were buried either in the church cemetery or there's a lot of little farm communities where there's just, if you drive around in the country, there's just like 6 or 8 headstones in this field, family cemeteries and things like that. So, and it's been there a lot of years, so I don't really, yeah, and it's just, I don't know, yeah.
What do you think was the most important thing you did?
Gosh, I don't know. Oh, and every instance, I treated them as friends. Basically, I never looked upon myself as, having the answer or what have you. And then, as in speech and hearing, a lot of the communication systems and stuff like that, I really felt like I'd done, some pretty good things there. Creating the systems and keeping them up and doing those things. But yeah, when I worked with the high functioning ladies on the ladies' side, I think I just being their friend was probably, everybody called me mom, but 68-year-old women were calling me mom, but yeah, I think we were just more friends and tried to work through, like, there were just rules they had to follow, and trying to get them to follow the rules without being too, I'm kind of easygoing. Yeah. Well, one of the hardest parts was to reconcile myself with the decisions made by the powers that be. I remember one situation that was just absolutely the hardest thing I had ever done in my life. There was a young woman, and she was not allowed any contact with her family at all. I mean, no contact at all. The decision was made that these people were not fit, and she couldn't have contact with them. But she also had a baby, and they turned the baby over to that family to raise. And I tell you, it's just unbelievable. And her family came to visit her, and her little girl was, I think, about 5 years old, and hadn't seen her since the day she was born. Had no contact at all with her family, and the family came to see her. And there was this big stir whether to let them see her or not, and just on and on and on. So finally the decision was made that she could see them with a chaperone. It turned out to be me. And I had to sit in that room, and I don't remember who the family members were, if it was a brother or a father or who it was. But she saw her little girl for the first time, and then she got word that her mother had since died. They caught her up on the family history, and I had to be the chaperone. And it was just more than and I talked to the social worker, and I said, why in the world, if those people are not fit to even have contact, come and visit her. Why did they turn the baby over? She said, well, that was a decision made by da-da-da-da. I'm thinking, I can't, that was hard. And there were a lot of things that would, those kinds of decisions, of course you had no input or anything, and it's just like trying to come to grips with it in your own mind and let it go. And there were a lot of things that were hard to let go. Yeah. Of course, I wasn't real happy with the way they treated us many times, too. Believe me, I wasn't very happy about it. But the people there that, were directly above me, they would go through whatever the steps were supposed to be, I felt like they were very hard-nosed about some things, but, just because it's just like turning that baby over to the family that the girl wasn't even allowed to visit. Yeah, things that don't make sense. And, there are many people that don't feel that they have to testify. I know when they made the decision, I was on the Human Rights Committee at the time, so a lot of times I'd have to go do the speaking. the decision was made that dolls were childish and no one can have a doll. Well, there were like those older ladies out there. They had these dolls sitting up on their dressers, the porcelain dolls from their childhood. Had to be disposed of. Didn't matter if it was their personal property. Disposed of, you know. That was across the board decision. And there was one group that had gone shopping, and they bought some of the little ones to set up, and they couldn't keep them. So I had to go talk to the superintendent about it. And he was just staring against the wall, and he just says, it's inappropriate, it will not be. And I said, but listen, you know, people collect these things. They're not inappropriate. Adults collect them. What about trains and so forth? Men play with trains, and you just stare at the wall, you know, and he was just repeating the mandate, you know, and just, I wanted to beat my head against the wall. Because he didn't listen. He wasn't going to listen. And, yeah, there were many of those decisions that, and when you look back on them, that was bad. Yeah, well, yeah. Well, personal property. And so then they were, like, they weren't allowed to have them, and then a few years down the road, we're trying to teach these people to enjoy personal property. You know. Yeah. It's just some of that, but I think it's just the way the wind is blowing at that particular time, and then a few years, then it changes, you know, and then it changes. And maybe that's the bad thing about being able to look back how it used to be, and then we were there when these things were going on. And some of the things are just downright laughable now, but at the time, well, I'll tell you one thing too. We moved from the education model to the hospital model. That's when we got rid of the dolls and stuff, you know, to the behavioral model, to da-da-da-da. You know, whatever's the popular thing at that particular time is how we had to conduct ourselves in that manner. And so I forgot where I was going with that one because it was kind of funny. Yeah. Oh, I know. When we went into the behavioral mode, Dr. Fox, have you ever heard of Dr. Fox? He wrote a book, Toilet Training in One Day. And so we had all had extensive training in behavior modification. You know, I'm sure it's Skinner, you know, and ringing, you know, the grid with electricity and all that kind of stuff, rewards, so forth. And so we were all trained in that method. And it was a big, long project. I know Dr. Fox and his toilet training things. I know my sister-in-law had twins, and she got his book from the library. She was going to train those twins in one day. And, you know, it's just like, it was just unbelievable. She gave it a good shot. Then several years later, Dr. Fox's methods are looked upon as almost abusive to children. But, you know, Dr. Fox came, he did seminars, you know, we got so many people on the toilet. And basically, I think we were able to train a lot of people to go to the bathroom. It may not have been the best method in the world, but we got them all trained to go to the bathroom. And we also had a lot of I worked with the low-functioning women that particular time, and they wouldn't leave clothes on. Absolutely would not leave their clothes on. You know, you couldn't get them to leave their clothes on. And we were ordered to make sure they wore clothes, you know, and you're just putting them on, they're taking them off. And so they came up with this behavior modification thing, and we all had pink aprons with little pockets in it. And we had marshmallows or M&Ms or different kinds of edible rewards. And it was this big, big, big project, and we go around, and every so often, you know, if they've got their clothes on, you pop something in their mouth, you know. And pretty soon we had almost no one that was taking their clothes off. But yet you consider, here we have this stuff in a dirty pocket, and we're popping it in everybody's mouth. What the heck are we spreading, you know? But I mean, it was just one of those, and we were told if you don't have your apron on, you could be fired. You know, I mean, that's how they handled it. But everybody was wearing clothes. Very rarely do we have people that didn't wear clothes after that. There's some of these big sweeping projects, you know. And glad they worked, but
You kind of feel like they're in a transition now, with getting people out into the community.
Yeah, now my friend is, I had already signed up to substitute teach in the community. My friend has since been able to, and I'm still waiting to be able to use this arm. But she said she had no idea the children in the different school systems that she taught at one special ed at one of the schools, and there was 3 that needed breathing treatment, several that were being tube fed. Some of them, she said, you would swear you were back on 15, that was our infirmary unit. But they're in the school system, and it's mandatory that they be there, They're not learning anything. The teachers aren't prepared for what they're having to do, but they're in school. They're not home. They're home and they're in school, but they're not in an institution, because now we have all these supports in the community. And that's the direction we've gone. I don't know, in the future, the broad picture, I don't know what that's going to be. Because, a lot of those kids, their life expectancy is definitely not very long, but, they're in school. I have my neighbor, she's had 3 children that have been very severely involved, and he's out of school now. The last one, her other 2 had since died, but the one that's still living, they pick him up on the bus, and he goes to DSI and for his job, and then he comes home in the evening. They also have respite care. There's funds for someone to take him, like for a weekend or whatever. They have somebody that comes to the house at various times. There's funding for that. And in the past, you would not have had. You'd just have to do the best you could. And so I don't know. I can see. I don't know how they're going. She had to go. They called her to sub in. Since she said she takes special ed, they call her a lot. And she said, unbelievable, by high school. She said, we had a unit, building 4, and it was very, very hyperactive, very, very undisciplined boys on that building. And she worked that building for a long time. She says, I swear, I thought I was back on 4 again. But it was in high school, So.
She could make a lot of parallels.
Yes.
Life in Muscatatuck.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it. I don't know. I think if parents have more support, it's easier for them to deal with the day-to-day than in the past when you just had to do the best you could. And I have a cousin. Let's see, Nancy would have been, Nancy would be probably 45 today. But she was born without muscles in her jaw. She couldn't close her mouth. And her husband's mother wanted her place in Muscatatuck. My aunt and her mother-in-law went around and around and around for a lot of years because Nancy did not look normal. She could not close her mouth. And so nothing would do that. Grandma said that's where she had to go, and that's how it was going to be. And my aunt's a nurse, and her husband was a Marine, so they had a lot of medical help that way. And Nancy, she went to regular school, and she was able to have, she went to the vocational technical school and to be a medical records clerk. And she worked as a medical records clerk, but she always wanted like a normal life. She wanted to have a boyfriend, she wanted a normal life. And she was a very severe diabetic, and when they were having cutbacks at the Columbus Hospital where she worked, the lady found out she was insulin dependent and cut her hours till she almost didn't get to work at all. And I told my aunt, I said, that can be, you can fight that. That's terrible. Yes, and why she was able to the woman herself was in a wheelchair, but she discriminated as Nancy. And Nancy got so depressed, and she refused to take her insulin. She passively committed suicide. And that was there she was in school and everything, but she still. Yeah, and well, you couldn't get her a boyfriend. I mean, you can't force her to have force somebody to be your boyfriend. I mean, those things you can't, like the parts of life she wanted, you can't give them to her. You can't make them for her. You can't, And there's a lot of people that don't have what she wanted. I mean, and they are fine too. But yeah, there's, yeah.
What would you say was the best thing the best for you?
Oh, my friends. Yeah, yeah.
And would your friends be people that you worked with, or some of the people that lived there?
Both. Yeah. Yeah. There's friendship on different levels. Of course, the people that I took care of or that I was in charge of, you'd be friendship on a different level.
What would you say was the worst?
Honest, I think the decisions that the administration made at different times for the clients. Well, like the decision that, they disposed of their personal property because it wasn't appropriate, it just, and there was no arguing about it, it was just done, it was just like the Gestapo, more or less. And many times there would be decisions that would be made across the board, because that's the way it was done now, and it didn't give people a chance to. We had, like I told you, the boys' side and the girls' side, and I was transferred from very low functioning men to the high functioning ladies when I changed. Like you would put in for a transfer, and you would transfer, your seniority would be on the boys' side, or your seniority would be on the girls' side. So when you would transfer to the other side, then your seniority slipped a little bit. So that's how they put it. So I was with these very high functioning young ladies, and most of them had jobs. We had jobs there on grounds, and then there were jobs where they came in town. Some of them came in town to work, and everybody wore, like the DSTs wore white uniforms, but we didn't wear hose or hats. Then there was ward clerks, and then the ladies, the clients that were in patient care, they had, I forget, probably gold uniforms. Some of them had blue uniforms if they worked in the kitchen, in dietary, as workers in dietary. But they all had jobs to go to during the week. And on weekends, we kind of just, it was really kind of enjoyable, like during the week, they got up, they went to work, they came back home, just like the rest of us did. On weekends, they would get up and they'd do their personal laundry, and they'd do their hair and their nails, and we would have we used to play like rummy in the day room on weekends just to pass the time, but it was their relaxation time. And so they all, like I said, they all had jobs. Well then, because of the peonage laws, unless we paid them, they didn't work. So they went from having something to do 5 days a week to absolutely, they were not allowed to do anything. And they were going to have a riot. One lady, she says, let's get all these hairspray cans and throw them through the window. She actually wanted to have a riot because they weren't allowed to work. And they weren't really getting, the rewards that they had at that particular time were like maybe an extra commissary book, which was like a $2 coupon book for the commissary, and whatever rewards they got from their job. But yeah, they, yeah. No, they were paid by the restaurants, but they weren't paid much. Of course, minimum wage at that time was very low. I think almost all of them, because they didn't get the minimum wage, I don't think they were allowed to work until something was worked out. When I was in high school, I worked for $20 a week in tips. Back then that was acceptable, but now I think a lot of restaurants don't pay really well. You work for the tips. But they had made the decision, had to be, So we had to go through a big, long process of, I think we did time studies for different chores that they could do, and then there was a minimum or a grading thing there. You know, if it took a certain percent of the time to do something that somebody from the outside would be able to do, you know, then they got paid that percentage, and money was allocated. But we had a long, hard time until it went from nothing until they found something. Those poor ladies, you know, they went through a lot of trauma. You know, because if you had a working girl, that's what we always called them, and she came to help you, we always treated them as peers. We didn't treat them as working girls or anything else. You know, they were our peers. And so they...
Working girl was sort of lifted together
Mm-hmm.
that helped you but didn't necessarily make the same wages.
They made no wages at all when we had working girls. Yeah.
The working girl was no pay for it.
Yeah, yeah. And but like I said, we always treated them as more or less as peers or friends, you know. And I'm sure there were some people that said, "Get over there and do such and so." But a lot of times, you said, "Let's do this together." So we worked together, and so they had that kind of a relationship with us. You know, they even though they weren't getting any money for it, they had the the relationship, and then all of a sudden it was just cut off. And it was, yeah.
Do you remember roughly what year that was for that?
Oh, let me think. Let's see. Early 70s. I was trying to think of different places I worked. So I'm sure it was in the 70s.
Were a lot of the residents working, or this is just very...
Well,
the higher function?
we had some working girls that really weren't very high functional, that they were able to, and I don't know how they made the decisions. There were a lot of those people. Every time we would change things around, and we changed things around so awful many times. I was there when, and that would have been in the early 70s. We had the boys' side and we had the girls' side. And a lot of them would meet in the middle at the hospital there, but if they got caught, they were in trouble. So we went from that way to overnight, we had one floor men and one floor women. And, I mean, that was just like one day it's this way and the next day it's this way. And they didn't have a transition period. I mean, it was unbelievable. You can imagine. But that's just, I mean, so we did that. Well, that was a big, massive move. I mean, we moved, people from one side of the grounds to the other. We moved. And then every so often we would change buildings again, and we'd move again for some unknown reason. I think, yeah. Yeah, because I remember one time we were going to have another big, massive move, and we had these questionnaires to fill out on each person, and then they would decide how they would be grouped, what score they got on these papers, this is where they would be. They'd be grouped that way. And I think about every move we had, the people still ended up grouped the same way, just in a different building, Oh, no. Ooh, no. No. And you know how there are some people you just can't get along with, no matter what. And we've had several people that they just can't stand each other. And no matter what, they end up in the same buildings. And it was always big fights. And there was no way to get away from them, because that's where they would be placed because of some score that somebody else assigned them, You
mentioned, I'm sorry, that there were girls' side, boys' side.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they'd meet in between. That wasn't allowed. Were there any pregnancies?
Yeah.
How was that?
Discreetly. If the family was willing to take the baby would be given to the family. We never had anybody born there. They always went to IU or someplace. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It really wasn't really.
Adoption. They closed records for 1 year. I just really. I guess, I don't know. But you know, adoption records are sealed. At that time they were, and you didn't know, like, you wouldn't be able to find out the history or anything. This, I don't know, this seemed to be normal.
It wasn't any big deal.
Well, I assume maybe the people having to deal with it, it did, but I mean, on our level, you know, just, you know.
Were there any pregnancies with residents and staff?
I don't know. I would assume not. And would be my philosophy on that. You know, that was before the pill. That was before the IUD. That was before, you know.
So sterilization, was that something that?
No. Well, remember the big eugenics movement in the 20s and the 30s, you know, and I think the charges were just being poor was a pretty good way to be sterilized, you know. That was a big movement in that time. And that was a big shock. You know, that was a bad thing. So then they turned around and went, instead of here, they go all the way over here. And I was on the Human Rights Committee at the time, and one of the girls kept begging to have her tubes tied, and they would not let that happen because of the stain of the eugenics movement in the past. Her aunt worked in a facility similar to ours, and she knew how her niece would be taken advantage of. And if if they could tie her tubes, she would be glad to have her niece come and live in her home and work there. But she wasn't going to take the responsibility otherwise. And she would beg and beg and beg, and she would ask for, you know, appointments with the committee and please, you know, and then out. And that was fine with her. Yeah. But yeah. Yeah, I don't recall. You know, when I read the abortion numbers that you see on the signs and everything, I'm thinking, where are they getting these numbers? You know, I just, you know, from my own experience, I'm just thinking, I don't know. I don't know where they're getting these numbers, and I'm sure that the numbers just grow and grow and grow and grow. I don't remember that ever even being, you know. Yeah. I don't remember it even being something that I even knew much about living in the community. It just wasn't something that just, you know. Yeah, somebody else may have the answer, but that's just something that just never was. Birth control was just such a big issue, you know. that in itself was an issue up until what year? They said, I think it was the state of Connecticut was the last state that they would even allow birth control to be discussed. You know, it's like in the 60s, I think. And up at that point, you didn't know about birth control unless you knew somebody that knew stuff. You know, it just wasn't discussed and wasn't bandied about.
What do you think about this judge?
Well, I didn't think it could really happen. I think it probably will now. And I don't know. I'm guessing it's the end of an era, like it was the end of an era for the poor farms and so forth. It's kind of unfortunate for the people caught in the cracks. You know, for those who are being born now when there's all these supports in the community. You know, that's one thing. But these people that's been their lives, that's where they spent their lives. And a lot of them came there as children, you know. And there was a story about one family that they had had their child on the waiting list, and it didn't come, it was like next year, maybe next year, and they said, I don't know if it's true or not, but they said they came by one day and had him set him down in a chair in the ad building and left. No forwarding address or anything. They could not get him in, and they were at wit's end, and that's how they did it. So I don't know if it's true or not, but I'd heard that story. And I'm sure that there are a lot of parents even yet today with the sports that maybe feel the same way. It's just, I don't know.
So do you think life would be better for children that might be able to close, or do you think it would be worse?
I don't think it'd be better. Even if the option for so many of them would be like nursing homes and things like that. And once you go to a nursing home, I know about nursing homes, even good ones, where they have, it's just it's an adjustment for them. They're leaving everything they've known all their lives. And, when I had, like I said, we'd spend the weekends with the high-functioning ladies, and they would be, doing their hair and what have you. And then they would sit around and talk about their childhood, and their childhood was at Muscatatuck. That was their childhood, and the things that went on, and the people that they knew, and things like that. It's hard to, many of us don't want to move on, I guess, but.
How do you see this having effects on people surrounding her?
It's been such a slow process, and they really have worked hard at job training and things like that. So I don't know, like the impact, the financial impact, I'm sure that's been eased to a certain degree. Because there are many people, the lady that delivers my mail I used to work with, she went to the post office. She has a postal job now. So, people that's managed to find jobs. And I figured I would never retire. I expected to go out of their feet first, personally. I mean, I'd been there, I was just like clients, I'd been there my whole life. How could I function on the outside? I'd been there my whole life. And so when I did take the retirement, that's that's culture shock for me too. But so many people it's been slow enough that people have found jobs. There's going to be some people I don't know, they're going to be like in the cracks there, it's going to be hard for them to. And there were several that could not take the retirement package that they offered because they were not close enough to Social Security age, that there would be a break in there when their money ran out. And insurance is another thing that's just absolutely unbelievable. And, if you're not close to Social Security and Medicare, why, you can't get insurance a lot of times. No, I don't. I know, this is just my guess, I know where there are some group homes, and I know who was sent to those group homes, and every once in a while I'll see in the police reports it's listed in the paper, indecent exposure, and then they'll have that general neighborhood. I can just about tell you who it is. But it's not indecent exposure because they're indecent, it's just because they want to take their clothes off, not giving them marshmallows anymore. So, it's not something that they, it's not sexual or anything like that. Just taking it over. Yeah. But other than that, just, from, I've really not heard. I used to hear from some of them years ago that went into foster homes and so forth and how they were getting along. But I would assume that if the person that they were living with got elderly, or we've had several that were returned to us because the caretaker was ill and unable to, they have to keep making that adjustment, constant, back and forth and back and forth.
So in terms of some of the public high functioning ladies, are they doing their living?
No, I don't. I've lost track. And we've often wondered about it. But see, we did not ever have any, unless they wrote to us personally, we wouldn't have any way of knowing. It's social services. And then once they were discharged, they didn't follow them. That was just something that, they went into another department or what have you. So somebody else was, and so we,
Music, Redwood Trail. Produced by Indiana Institute on Disability and Community, Center for Health Equity. Funded by the Indiana Governor's Council for People with Disabilities. Copyright 2019, the Trustees of Indiana University.